Well, hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Brenda McSweeney, a founding member of Unbound Visual Arts. UVA creates exhibits and programs to encourage learning, engagement, and change. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to tonight's exhibition program. This exhibit's theme, Stronger Sisterhood, representing intersectional identity, emerged from conversations of our curator as well as tonight's moderator, Paige Moreau, with UVA's executive director, John Quattrale. Intersectionality has been a focal theme at Boston University's Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, where I'm on the research faculty. Colleagues there have been teaching courses on race, class, and gender, so I am doubly thrilled to be seeing the representations that the 10 participating artists this evening have captured in their innovative works. Exhibit curator Paige Moreau has drawn on an analytical framework set up by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. Paige, an art historian with special interest in Latin America, will be conveying her own interpretations and enthusiasm on identity politics. She works in museum education at the Springfield Museums in Western Mass. Paige has a bachelor's in art history from the University of Connecticut, plus a master's in art history from UMass Amherst. Her recent research interests are in modern Latin American art, post-colonial studies, decolonizing art institutions, and especially identity politics. She plans to pursue a PhD in art history and go on to a curatorial career. Fun fact, you can find Paige in her spare time doing yoga, going for a run, or working on her hand embroidery. We'll be hearing as well from 3 of our talented artists who will be sharing their unique interpretations of the theme. They are Linda Clave, a longstanding exhibitor with Unbound Visual Arts, and 2 new UVA members, Maya Monteguto and Nilu Muchella. Let me shout out thanks to our co-sponsors, Boston University's Women's and Gender Studies, and also the Gender and International Development Initiatives at Brandeis University's Women's Studies Research Center. Again, a huge welcome to each of you joining us this evening. And now over to you, Paige. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda, for that introduction. As Brenda mentioned, my name is Paige Moreau, and I am the curator for Stronger Sisterhood, representing intersectional identity. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Well, I'd like to spend the majority of our time talking about the work of these 3 fantastic artists who have been so gracious to join me this evening. I first wanted to take a moment to talk about the show kind of as a whole and how I came to conceptualize it with kind of the help of John Quattrale. So as a scholar of art history, I often find myself thinking about identity. The identity of an artist, the identity of the people that they're depicting in their work, and the identity of the people who are viewing the art. For this exhibit, I wanted to bring identity politics to the forefront. Who or what do we identify as? How do the different categories that are ascribed to us or that we ascribe to ourselves intersect? And this kind of brings me to Kimberly Crenshaw, who Brenda mentioned earlier. In 1989, lawyer, civil rights activist, and critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality to describe how gender, race, class, and other individual characteristics intersect and augment oppressions faced by people. This show is meant to uncover how people view their intersecting identities while also fashioning the term within a larger framework of the history of the feminist movement in the 20th and 21st century. Today I'm joined by 3 artists of disparate backgrounds who have all created work that deals with the experiences of women and in some cases with the added layers of other intersecting identities. The first artist I want to formally introduce is Nilu Muchella. Originally from Mumbai, Nilu has been inspired to juxtapose found objects, memorabilia, and the use of language to create social and political narratives. She has exhibited in a range of gallery spaces in the Northeast and also creates public art. Nilu has been an award recipient of numerous grants, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council and the New England Foundation for the Arts. The second artist I would like to introduce is Linda Clave. Linda maintains her studio in Brighton and has been an active participant in the annual Alston Arts District Open Studios. She also participated in Unbound Visual Arts' Healthful exhibition and the Honan Alston Library Art Gallery in 2015. She has participated in many other solo and group exhibitions in the area. The final artist that I would like to introduce is Maya Monteguto. Maya was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts to immigrant parents from Guatemala. While pursuing her bachelor's in psychology at Connecticut College, she ventured into graphic design. In 2017, Maya graduated from Lesley University's graduate school with an MA in mental health counseling with a concentration in expressive arts therapies. I also want to acknowledge all of the other artists whose work appears in this show. All of their names are listed here. Sorry. And you can find out more about them on UVA's website. So without further ado, and here are our artists as well, I want to get into our discussion and start talking with our artists. So the first question I have for everybody is, what does intersectionality mean to you, and what compelled you to submit work to this exhibition? So maybe Nilu, if you want to start, and then we can kind of get a feel for everybody.
Thanks, Paige, and welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this wonderful artist talk. I'm so honored to be part of this program. I didn't really know what intersectionality meant till I landed up in the US at the age of 18 in 1990. I didn't know that I was a minority, quote unquote, because in the country of origin, I wasn't. I was an urban, semi-elite individual. And I had to redefine my whole existence based on, being here in a different sort of population. The other layer on top of that was, of course, attending a women's college where I was nurtured and kept safe for 4 years of undergraduate education. But after that, again, being thrown out into the wilds of the US, I would say professional system. There are the challenges that you face in a, semi-male dominated, professional culture. But I've put together a couple of intersectionality, crosses that I was thinking about that applied to me necessarily. One is definitely the idea of being an immigrant that eventually evolved into being a citizen, but what that sort of bridge felt like, being a foreigner and then also belonging, and the problems that you face when you go back and forth between two cultures. America has defined me so much. I've been here since a very young age, but India also informed my existence so much till the age of 18. So where do I actually stand? And there is this crossroads. And I feel like I keep jumping back and forth between these sometimes, or nobody can exactly pinpoint, what that crossroad is. Of course, the other crossroad is, male versus female, and some of those issues and problems we face, whether in the professional or personal environment. Another one actually is as a designer and an artist, and that's much more of a professional bent, but it really consumes me a lot of the time because I straddle both these worlds again. And for me, that's another form of intersectionality, that I'm trying to pursue one as a career that's, I would say, financially, stable, and the other is a much more personal venture. And so how do you, make these two connect and come to a point? So actually there are a lot of axes in my life. And the last one, of course, is being Asian versus, living in a majority population that isn't Asian, which I was used to as a, as a young child. I've actually written about this idea of in-between space. I call it in-between space, like this idea of bridging these different points. And I'll just read a little snippet. I'm very interested in exploring the space in between, the shift in narrative that we experience as we cross between different real or imagined spaces, whether it is our country, our culture, our sense of identity or ourselves. When you truly do not belong to one space or the other, how can you address the sense of loss, but also fluidity and the different aspects of that existence? So that's it for me right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that that idea of this like liminal kind of in between space is really important. There's both power and pain in it, and how you kind of traverse that says a lot. Yeah. Linda, I want to ask you the same question. So in reading the call for art, what compelled you to submit work? And then maybe what does intersectionality mean to you?
Well, that was a very difficult question. And I usually create something new for a show, but I couldn't. So basically, I looked at what I had already done and contemplated how the inner and outer world that I tried to bridge, starting when I was a child. Everything came from my dreams, and I was an imaginative dreamer, not somebody who is out there in the big world doing more practical things. So I was drawing and creating my world. And it was very, very important to me to have the space to do that. So I never thought of myself becoming an artist. I thought of myself maybe becoming a designer of some sort, especially costume designer, because I like to go back in history and in times, and go to ancient cultures in Greece, and especially the Latin American cultures of the Incans and the Mayans and people who had lived in the Southwest, the Hopis. I'm very attracted to that sensibility of the way they understood living with nature and the land, and developed an understanding of how everything has cycles and meaning. And that was a theme that came to me over and over and over again when I was in Quaker school and doing works on peace. What would peace mean to you? And I said it had to start with me becoming inside the person I needed to be. And that was sort of like began the journey of being able to identify myself instead of identify with an outer group or a large institution of any sort. And when I was even younger than that, when my parents moved to Argentina and we were there, I'm an old lady, we were there in the 50s during the Peron Revolution. And I was an American who came with blue jeans with a fly up the center, with not a fly on the side. This was what girls were supposed to do. They were supposed to look pretty, and they were not supposed to be wearing jeans, and they weren't supposed to be doing certain things. So I was completely an immigrant outcast in a society that I didn't choose to be in. And we were there for a number of years, and then we came back to the United States, and then I had to start all over again and recreate my identity. This has been a theme that went on over and over and over again. And when I thought about intersectionality, it was about how do you dig deep inside yourself and find meaning. And for a long time, I felt like when I went to art school, I felt very oppressed by the male dominance in the art school that I went to. I was at BU School of Fine Arts, and I learned some wonderful things. And I also had some very oppressive encounters with teachers. And the reason is that they saw me as becoming a housewife and never pursuing my artwork when I graduated. They thought it was sort of a waste of time for me to be there. That's pretty bad. So it took a lot of me wanting to be my own voice and not echo things that I learned from other people. So I spent a lot of time in my studio, not necessarily exhibiting or doing anything outward, but looking deeply and getting more and more involved in meditation and having things come to me. the first things I started realizing that I was more interested in the inner landscape than the outer landscape. And I went to a very traditional school where you did drawings of the figure and landscapes, and I learned to see and see objectively. Now I was back into looking internally, and I would have roses and five-pointed stars, and different words would come to me, and I said, well, why don't I just paint those things? Give up all the rest of it. And, you know, I'm not going to solve the history of art. I'm not going to change the world, but I can at least express my own world. So that's, you know, so intersectionality, I was totally unaware of the word until you made this proposal. And I called up my friends who were pretty much in my age group, and none of them had heard of it either. And this was artist friends. And so they said, well, that's weird. And well, does it mean, you know, a combination of different sexual preferences, et cetera? And I said, well, in my case, obviously it isn't the case, but it, you know, it could. So I really had a hard time deciding what exactly, how I would approach it.
Right, and I think that it can be telling that this term maybe hasn't been around for a long time, and it's something new that we're kind of considering the ways in which these different layers of identity kind of impact the way that a person moves through the world. And I think it's interesting that the way that you thought about it in a lot of ways was very internal and going within and thinking about these experiences you've had and how they bubble up in your life. So thank you, Linda.
One last thing is like, because I now have this word, it gives me like a classification for a lot of experiences that I didn't have before, and it compresses a lot of layers of experience. And the work that I chose to put in the show was basically based on that.
Yeah, it's a useful term, and it kind of gives a word to something that I think was otherwise ineffable for a time. So thank you. And then finally, I want to pose this same question to Maya. So again, what does intersectionality mean to you, and what compelled you to submit work to this exhibition?
Yeah.
Ooh, Maya, you're coming in a little spotty.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's better.
Hold on. Can you guys still hear me?
No, I can't quite hear you, Maya, unfortunately.
I can't see her either. She's not on my screen.
Let me.
I'll mute myself.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
That's a little bit better. Let's roll with it.
All right, we're gonna have to, of course, technical difficulties on the day of. So I was just saying that my experience with intersectionality is the inverse of kind of Linda's experience. I've been acutely aware of it, just given my background in education, as well as being first generation for a lot of things, whether it was college or grad school. So the call to art for intersectionality for me really felt like a personal therapeutic process in which I explored kind of my own travels and conflicts along the way, whether it was becoming an artist or pursuing higher education. I think that I really appreciated the call for art for this specific topic because it gave me the opportunity to explore maybe some underlying themes of being an immigrant child, of being a first generation, artist in a way that is viewed very differently in Guatemalan culture versus American culture. It's also a big part of the ongoing work that I do with diversity and equity, whether it's within the school systems or in the mental health field. So it really felt amazing to explore this topic in a very visual way. I think at the end of the day, it felt like a therapeutic release for me, which is really what I do for my 9 to 5.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I wanted to move actually into discussing your work a little bit. So for this exhibition, you created new work that directly responded to the call for art, which you kind of just mentioned. So I'm curious how these pieces fit into your larger practice as an artist. And these are the pieces that are up on screen now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, intersectionality literally was a combination of this geometric physical idea of just intersections, but also the various cultural influences that I feel. I do consider myself a child of two worlds. I was born here in America, but I'm very rooted in my Guatemalan culture. I'm also have some Mayan heritage as well. So all of these kind of motifs I feel are explored through my art and the layering of it. I find my work is never simple. There's a lot of complexity to it, layer upon layer. And it's a very organic process for me. So like I was saying earlier, the call to make art for intersectionality felt like a homecoming because I hadn't realized it was a theme that I hadn't fully unpacked yet. And I think that this exhibit really gave me the opportunity to explore that further.
Yeah, thank you. Oops. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, the work that you show, I mean, it has both what you were saying about this geometric intersection and then these really organic forms. And so I think it's so interesting the way that you talk about how it felt very like nascent and part of you, and you're bringing together these two ideas in a very visual way that I think is very digestible and easy to understand, while also having all of these really interesting layers. So thank you for that. And then Linda, I wanted to kind of move back to you and talk about some of your work. So your work kind of, at least from my perspective, I feel deals with a long tradition of goddess imagery and the feminine divine. And I'm curious how you feel these pieces and these ideas are still pertinent in contemporary issues, something that's so long-standing regarding women's rights and identity politics. Oh, Linda, you're still muted.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I feel like having to constantly fight for an identity, which I felt like I have in my life as a female artist, just as a female. And I started by, well, I was born into a more traditional Protestant background where there wasn't a lot of feminine goddesses or deities or anything of that nature. And it was looking into artwork that I found deeper and deeper roots in traditions where women's forms, not only physical forms of their bodies, but also the forms of the way they presented things, opened up doors of identity. And I think that that's still true now because women's bodies are being oppressed with new laws, even here in the United States, with new laws of limiting women's right to choose and people wanting to limit what women can do once more in places like over on the West Bank. I saw a Facebook comment where women now are being asked by Hamas to have permission from a male to travel, where they didn't have that before. So like women's right to choose their life is an ongoing issue. And if you don't have a deity or a sense of identity with a larger being that has also the power to be, then you're losing some of the ground, because a lot of a lot of backgrounds right now are going back into fundamentalism And if there isn't anything underneath the, anything on the core level, then it's very hard to argue that. If not argue it on an intellectual level, just on knowing where you are and feeling strong in that. And my identity with these forums came from spending a lot of time in meditation and working through in paint what I felt. It was very important to make it a personal journey, and that is a statement that I put out. This painting is now hanging in a shelter in Boston, and hopefully inspiring people who need a sense of beingness, because they've been uprooted from everything.
Right, like that idea of connection, and you were saying like going back to fundamentals and going back into one's history and one's past and finding those roots, I think can be, like you said, very grounding for people. And without that, you can feel lost and untethered. Yeah, and I think that you're right, that does just kind of follow through with all of history and with even the way that we think about women's experiences now. Yeah.
And so I started out, looking at Goya, and there was these wonderful paintings of his etching series with his sort of like seeing resurrections, or seeing people who are, evolving into the spirit world. And I thought, there's not one woman in that scenario, and
Right.
we never see a resurrection of a female. It's always a male. So I had another painting that I shared with you. I don't know if you can pull it up on the screen. The Amazon image.
I don't know that I have that one. Is that one of these two?
No,
Sorry, you're trying to go
that's
back.
a view of my current studio. No, and that's current work.
Okay, I might not have it.
Okay, well, anyway. Oh, there it was. You just flashed one back. You just had it. No, there. The
Yeah, I
one,
think it's fine. A little bit.
okay, the one that I call Amazon Angel is on my left side when I'm looking at the screen.
Mm.
And I started out as a hummingbird woman, and then I started out as also wanting to see something that lifted, that wasn't quite human, but had the spirit of the Amazon River, which I felt very strongly about nature and about preserving life itself, which is a very feminine point of view from well, just a very feminine point of view, and that this was an angel helping preserve the Amazon. And that's the rainforest, as most people know, is going through tremendous deforestation and exploitation. And the exploitation of nature is something that I care a lot about. And this painting is very old, but I worked on it for a long time. And it's to empower with feminine energy the sense of protection. And the one next to it, well, just since it's up on the screen, I'll mention I was looking to submit something to a project with another musician friend of mine, and we did something about riding on the subway. And there was somebody who was sitting near us who had a violet colored outfit on. So I had a journey of the violet woman. And I had one for each train stop that we stopped at, so it would be like a kaleidoscope of different images that would float across. And this was the main character of the violet woman.
Great, thank you for sharing that.
And
Yeah,
the
now
other
I
pieces
just-
you showed were just more contemporary pieces. I've been working with music mostly,
Yeah.
sharing music. I work with a musician in live performances.
Yeah, and we'll get to those more contemporary pieces too. But for now, I want to shift over to Nilu and ask about your process as an artist. So for the pieces that you put into the show, the Singular Multiplicity and the Virus series, they have very different processes. So for Singular Multiplicity, it's this meticulously data-driven and computer-generated work, and the Virus series were born out of these 10, 15-minute sketches. And I'm just curious, and I think everybody might be curious to hear, why did these different projects call for such different approaches?
Thanks, Paige. So actually, in response to your question, is using, I think, two opposite parts of my brain. It's like the designer versus the artist in me. This particular piece, Singular Multiplexity, I'm going to read something about it, but I will tell you it was definitely in response to trying to create some sort of system of organization that I created it in response to interviewing 20 plus women about their various stages in life, whether professional or personal. And in contrast, the Virus series, if you want to skip to that slide for a minute.
Is it coming up for you?
Yeah, there it is. So the red one on the left side was one of the first pieces I did in response to the pandemic, and these are very emotional. They're very much trying to make sense of like what's happening during this pandemic. It's a way to have a sort of personal release, and definitely not so, I would say, mindful or strategic or planned out. It's very much everything bubbling, you know, out and like just getting it over on paper. So going back to the other piece, the one that's more data driven, I did that a couple of years ago, and there are a couple of questions. There were a series of 8 to 10 questions I asked participants, and then I compiled this piece in response to that. And interestingly enough, some of the questions were, how do you define your feminist space in the context of your everyday life? In your professional life, have you ever felt aware of the glass ceiling effect? So is there some point where, you know, it's saturated or stopped? As a parent, mother, aunt, how would you cultivate a sense of equality and liberation in the next generation? And one of the other questions that stood out to me in the context of this exhibit is, as a woman from a different ethnicity or culture, if applicable, what do you feel comes first if you had to prioritize ethnicity or women's issues? Which I thought was like an interesting, you know, I mean, it's going back to what Kimberly was talking about in her TED talk, and just, you know, is it being a woman or is it the race? And when you're like in those crossroads, you often get shoved off, you know, that
Right.
crossroad because it's very hard to define. And so in response to that, the interviews, I then created this sort of mimicking the Da Vinci, you know, ideal male figure. Here is like the non-ideal female figure with all these data-driven sort of pie charts on top of her, and each of them is categorized by the responses. And this is definitely a, you know, part of my art practice as well, engaging the community, trying to draw voices in and somehow interpose them onto the pieces that I create.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting too how you mentioned that this Vitruvian woman is kind of unidealized in that she has all of these pie charts and helixes superimposed over her body, and it's almost like sometimes I feel like women have to overcompensate because we're assumed to be one side of the left brain, right brain spectrum, or there's a tradition in our history where women have been considered to be like more mystical and more like of nature. And so this seems like trying to combat that with all of this hard data. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition to have that kind of over this female form.
Actually, something I wrote in response to this was, you know, it is the Da Vinci like female interpretation of the perfect woman, but it traps her and yet she's trying to break through. So there's this sense of like she's kind of oppressed like under it and she's trying to get beyond it. but also the, each pie in it plays with the concept of gender labels and stereotypes, and how we try to neatly package the other into safe pockets, when really every individual female is, unique and has their own perspective and voice. So that was something I was, trying to express at that time through this particular piece.
Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely feel that comes through. So I appreciate that.
Also, I'm not Hindu by religion, but the whole idea of like the Hindu mythology and the goddess of destruction, and you kind of go into some of those, representations of Kali, who was like this very powerful goddess, and there are definitely some references to that as well in that piece.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels very all-encompassing. And I think by nature it is because of all the data. And next, I just want to move into talking about your artistic practices as a whole, and thinking about what's next for you. What are you working on now? Maybe how has the pandemic kind of changed your artistic practices? So Linda, I'm curious if you have anything to say about that.
Well, the pandemic, several things have shaped that for me. One is I lost my studio in a bigger space, so I had to compress myself into a smaller space. And then along came the pandemic, and I had to give up the things that I was doing with musicians, going out and performing, where I did live painting. The painting you see me standing in front of on the left there was done at a live performance at a college with Stephanie Woods, who played the Tibetan bowls. And it was accomplished over a period of like an hour or two. And then of course I take it home and I touch it up a bit and, polish it a bit more, but it's basically based on the sounds in paint. And the one on the right is something I've been doing with these wonderful inks that have such beautiful color on UPO, and they come through translucently. It's almost like I don't have to work in stained glass. I can work with these inks on this translucent paper. And it wasn't done particularly to music, but it has to do with the flow of I'm very interested in the elements, the fire, the earth, the air, the water, the ether. And I consider that as I'm doing these.
Yeah, thank you. And it does feel a lot like stained glass. It's interesting the way that those materials react. So next I kind of want to move over to Maya and maybe think about how these pieces that you submitted to the show kind of fit into your larger practice, and maybe what's next for you and what are you working on now?
Yeah. So as I through the past year, it's very difficult for
Oh, Maya, you're breaking up again a little bit.
gotta love technology. You guys hear me? Hopefully. Can you guys
it's okay.
hear me a little?
Give it a shot.
All right. Anyway, so the past year has been very difficult with the pandemic. My role as a mental health specialist and expressive therapy, I found that the visual representation of our emotions, fears, really for the past year. As far as like moving forward with works, I think that this exhibit of intersectionality really opens up kind of the floodgate for me of subconscious things that I haven't fully processed just yet. And I think that that's where this exploration further of multiple layers, multiple identities, understanding professionally kind of where I'd like to move to next. I love being able to view my fellow artists' work, but I have neglected that side of me because I've had to focus on the mental health component for the past 2 years. So I think that for me, it's it's a new artistic journey at this point, and I'm very excited to continue exploring that. So in a way, I feel like this has been kind of a rebirth for me, and really focusing on that practice and that skill set now.
Yeah, it's like a reset. Yeah, and I feel like this dichotomy between the internal self and the external self, like everything that's happening on the outside in this piece that I have up now, and then everything that's happening on the inside, and the kind of struggle between the two, and finding a balance there. Yeah. Thank you. And then finally, if we want to shift back over to Nilu, if you want to talk a little bit about what else you're working on right now.
So this is part of a series of 10 suitcases that I created towards the end of 2019 before the pandemic hit. And actually, I'll be installing it this coming Sunday at the Fort Point Arts Community Gallery down in Fort Point, Boston. It's part of a larger show with 4 other artists, and we deal with family, memory, and displacement. That is the common theme that connects all of us. So it's 4 artists from different countries, and we all are immigrants here, 4 female artists, I should say. And the other artists have 2-dimensional work, and I'm the one who has created literally 10 suitcases with my baggage in them. But each suitcase talks about a different phase in my life, from being a child to part of like a generational lineage, to an immigrant, to a parent. And so it's going to be up for the next month. So if you are down by Fort Point, please stop by and see this. And it's something I've never worked in before, this medium, to actually create these 3-dimensional assemblages. So as a practicing designer, it goes against everything I do, which is so meticulous and measured. And this was just a complete release to create chaos and make it completely personal. For example, the suitcase that has India, America on it, it maps the travels of my particular family. So my father and mother both studied here, but went back to India in the late 50s. And then my older sister came, my younger sister came, and so did I. So actually our family has always been displaced. All of us were always an outsider to another country, and then eventually to our own country as well. And this particular suitcase talks about, that particular pathway that we've all somehow been displaced at some level and traveled away, not only from each other, but from our country of origin. If you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah.
And so this is a version of the virus series. If you recognize like some of the drawing on the first sort of suspension, and it's been installed in the sprinkler factory in Worcester just this past week. It's opening next week. So the idea behind this is it's 3 shrines or memorials to commemorate those who've been adversely affected by the pandemic, and it's part of a larger show. This is a very big space. It's the manufacturing floor of a old sprinkler factory. So it's about 5,000 square feet or more. And the show is called Trios, which is, 3 of anything. And so there's 3 paintings, 3 sculptures. People have submitted different stuff, and I entered these particular pieces, and they are fabric printed versions of my original sketches. So that'll be up to for the next month if anyone's going to take a trip out there. And I'm trying to see if I can, expand this body of work with the pandemic series and get it into other places for the future as a commemoration mainly of what we've all been through.
Yeah, and Nilu, what's the writing on these panels?
So the writing on the panels is, it's called Spontaneous Coronaverse, and it's been done by a writer friend of mine, and he actually typed poetry on his antique typewriter from like the 1980s or something, in response to the pandemic and lockdown, where we were all, at home working and schooling and blah, blah, blah. And that was his sort of release. And so we decided to collaborate on that. And there are pieces of those words incorporated into this particular installation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And so finally, I would just want to move into our Q&A session. So if anybody in the audience has questions for the artists, feel free to pop them into the chat. And then the screen up right now is the artists and Unbound Visual Arts social media channels. So you can find Maya, Nilu, and Unbound Visual Arts all on Instagram. And then Linda Clave has her Facebook page, which is the one at the bottom. I do have a couple of questions that are already in the chat. The first one comes from Susan, who asks Linda, I think of the last piece that we saw of yours, are they alcohol inks? So I think she's asking about the medium that you used.
I use Jacquard's Piñata colors, and I got them at Blick.
Thank you. Another question that I have is, will any of the artists continue exploring intersectionality in their art or in other ways?
No,
Was that a no from Linda?
I'd have to say yes for me. I think that, like I was saying earlier, it's been a theme in various stages of my life, and I really appreciated the freedom of being able to explore it in this exhibit. And I feel like there's more to unpack, and that is the nature of intersectionality, is that we're never really done. I think that there's also this other layer of privilege that I would like to explore further with intersectionality, as I feel that even through the experience of fellow artists and family members, coworkers, and conversations leading up to the exhibit, the level of privilege of knowing the
Oh, Maya, I'm losing you a little bit. Sorry, can you repeat that last part?
Yeah, no, for sure. Just what I've noticed with conversations about personality is the privilege of being aware or not aware of it, of the definition itself. And I'd want to explore that further. I think this exhibit kind of opened up that curiosity for me, and I'd want to pursue a visual representation too.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah, if anyone else wants to answer that question, feel free.
Sure, I think in one way or the other, we're always addressing that as female artists or, non-white artists for those that, apply to that category. So it might not be exactly intersectionality, but they're always identity politics and, framing of certain situations we're always examining.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's essentially impossible to get away from. So in some way or another, you will be exploring it. Yeah. And then I do just have a comment from somebody in the chat. It is great hearing everyone's perspective on intersectionality. Your words and experiences are thought-provoking, and everyone's artwork is inspirational. Thank you. And I couldn't agree more. But just in the interest of time, we're rounding out almost an hour. I want to thank everybody so much for being here, for all the artists, for submitting work, and for agreeing to do this talk with me. I really appreciate it. Again, for everybody in the audience, please follow along these artists on their social media pages and follow Unbound Visual Arts. I'm sure there's plenty more amazing work to come from the organization. And we will be having another program next week, same time, same day of the week. So Thursday on the 4th at 6. A colleague of mine from Bay Path University, Janine Fondon, is going to be talking about different women's experiences and what she calls like hidden voices. So thinking about women from different backgrounds and bringing their voices to the forefront. So we look forward to seeing you next week and having you all here again.